I'm Sarah O'Leary from Myash. Thanks for joining us again today for this webinar. Today's topic is the story of the lopsided critical risk bow tie, a very popular topic today. And before I introduce the presenter, I'll just let you know the webinar will be recorded, and later today via email we'll share a podcast and a copy of the video recording. So you can share that later if you like. Today's also, we're going to have a bit of interaction today, so stay tuned. There'll be an opportunity for you to contribute and provide feedback to some of the questions that Mark is going to provide. Today's presenter is Mark McLaren from Art of Work. Mark began his career working with not-for-profits and large private and public sector organisations, facilitating performance improvements, focusing on strategy, people engagement, and enabling leaders. Creativity and different thinking have been at the heart of building more effective leaders and teams. Mark has founded and led several successful ventures, including an incubator for small business startups, large national workplace psychology and organisational practice, and a thriving workplace health and safety consulting for high risk and complex organisations. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah, and it's great to join you all in what will hopefully be a conversation around the idea of a lopsided bow tie. Many of you will be familiar with the bow tie. It's a risk management tool that's used to try and understand critical risk that is material in nature, which is both about serious injury and fatalities through to significant business interruption, loss of revenue, and also environmental and sustainability issues. In the middle of the bow tie is the unwanted event or the failure or the loss of control. And you'll see that in a bow tie, we spend a lot of time, rightfully so, focusing on the left-hand side, where we try to identify what are all the causal pathways that might give rise to this loss of control event. Then time is spent with people across an organisation trying to understand not only those causal pathways, but also what are the controls in place that prevent this incident from happening or this loss of control. And it's rightfully so that we should focus on that. But there are also some downsides in that. Often what gets lost or overlooked is the right-hand side of the bow tie, which is really both the impact pathways. So what would happen as a result of this event occurring? And then secondly, and very importantly, how might we mitigate that? How might we reduce the impact of the damaging energy? I think it's useful to think a bit about why might a bow tie end up being prevention lopsided? Why might that be the case? Sam is going to share in the chat function for you a link to a Jamboard. So if you'd like to, please, Sam, share that link. And if people would like to open up the Jamboard, and I'm going to show you then how that Jamboard then works. So the way we'll look at the Jamboard is fairly simple. What we will do is we will get you to use your post-it notes and see what you come up with. So let me demonstrate how that works, and then please feel free to have a go. So you'll see I'm sharing my screen. Over here, underneath the little select button is a sticky note or a post-it note. You click on that and then you type in your idea. You can change the color of your post-it notes. You can do all sorts of things. Hit save. And then you could do another one. Could be second idea. You are not limited. You've obviously also worked out that with this, it is totally anonymous. So I have no idea who is or not on this particular board. So Sam, we'll just need one link, I think. And can I invite people to please put in your ideas, and let's see what you come up with. Now, that would be fantastic. So you can see that the board is here. Let's have a look and see what people have come up with in terms of their ideas. Okay, so we can see a number of results already coming up. Fantastic. So let's just have a bit of a quick look at this, and please feel free to share. This is really helpful insights into why we might end up with this sort of lopsided bow tie. And we'll do some analysis of this as we go. It's really interesting if you start having a look at this, and you can see that we've got a whole range of people, nearly 50 odd people on this board. So we can see that, you know, part of it might be seen as an issue of complacency. Someone has suggested that maybe, you know, part of it is that it's to do with zero harm. And with that is probably an assumption that we can prevent all incidents. There's also probably a view that links up to that in many ways, that prevention is better than the cure. Another person's called out and sort of challenging this idea of zero harm, saying, well, it's a bit of a fallacy that we think, you know, all incidents are necessarily preventable in nature. There's a tendency to focus on compliance that might drive us more to thinking about the left-hand side of the bow tie. You can see here a number of people are calling out and going, well, maybe part of it is this sort of zero harm focus. Could that potentially drive this sort of focus on the board? So I think that's just really helpful just to see those ideas unfold. I think part of it is that the reason why we tend to become lopsided is there's a natural tendency to say we want to prevent the unwanted event. And with that then comes, to a degree, a confidence that's placed in the controls we design. And so we can end up, in a sense, almost then believing that this is possible to prevent the lopsided bow tie. I suppose the second question that is fairly important to think about is then, what are the potential downsides of a lopsided bow tie? So if you just click on the screen and move to the next slide presentation. So on the board, if you go to number 2, you'll see a little arrow there. I'm just going to share. I'm sharing that now. You'll see up the top here, there's an arrow. So I'm going to get you to go to the next board. And so what might be some of the potential downsides of this? So away you go. Can I give you a moment to lock in your thoughts of that on this bow tie? So we've got a number of ideas as to why we might be lopsided in our bow tie, but is that really a problem? Is that really a concern? So you'll see that Sam and I are just arranging your post-it notes, and we'll have a look at a moment in terms of what sort of thinking people have come up with in terms of your thinking. So you can see here that we've got a bit of a reoccurring theme. Part of the problem with that, if we just focus on the left-hand side, we actually don't allocate resources to respond when there is failure, or we end up with a poor response ability to deal with failure. Also, people are calling out that it then tends to become a pressure to hide incidents if the response is not well managed when we actually have the loss of energy take place. It's often also about people not knowing. And I thought it's a really interesting comment. Failures may escalate out of control. So when we don't have a sufficient focus on the right-hand side of the bow tie, then we really have limited recoverability. So you can see here a number of challenges with this in terms of being the lopsided bow tie. So I'll go back to the presentation, and I've got a third question for you just to consider. And Sam, could you please share the Google form link? So what we'd like to think about is what's the balance struck between preventative and mitigating controls in your organisation. So I'd like you to hop up into the helicopter, maybe at a couple of thousand sort of metres, and look back at your organisation. And as you do that, I'd like you to think about, well, what is this balance in our organisation? We can see the reason for being lopsided. We can see some of the dangers or perils or risks of not focusing sufficiently on the right-hand side of the bow tie. Can I now ask you just an honest, and again, it is totally anonymous, your experience in your own organisation. And I'll pull up the results now, Sam, and we'll have a look. So you can see so far that we've got 6 responses locked in. So away you go. Let's have a look and see what people have come up with. And you can see here a fairly consistent theme. If I have a look at the orange and the red. So what we're seeing here is nearly 2/3 of you are saying there's quite a dominant focus on preventative. Red, a third are saying 80% is preventative, 20% is mitigating. So it seems like this is very much resonating with your experience in your organisation. And what we'd like to try and unpack today is how we might actually right this imbalance in the bow tie. So feel free to keep locking in your responses. And as Sarah has said, we will share these with you later on today. So let's move back into the thing. Now, why might this become a particular problem? I think it's really helpful to separate out prevention from something that is predictable. A really helpful analogy of this is the flipping of a coin. I'm going to grab a coin and I'm going to flip it. And I'll ask you, heads or tails? Heads or tails? And the good news is you have a 50-50 chance of predicting what the outcome will be. And as I flick that coin more often, and let's say now I've flipped it and I've recorded the heads and tails, well, guess what? We're now moving to something like almost 100% predictability, because with 100 flips of the coin, we've now got this 50-50. So I can say to you, after numerous flips, it's a 50-50 probability that it'll be a heads or tails. But each time I flip that coin, I don't have absolute predictability about what the result is. All I can say is I have a 50% likely call out. So what does this actually end up leading to? Well, it leads to an overconfidence bias. And it's a fairly prevalent bias when it comes to managing work, managing risk, and the inevitable variability between the way work is, I suppose, imagined or planned or intended, and how work is actually done in reality. And we can see here what happens is that we have a person's subjective confidence, and that's based upon their past judgments. And what they say is that that's reliably greater than the objective accuracy of their judgments. And I think this is at the core of why it is we end up with a lopsided bow tie. Because we invest, and rightfully so, in prevention, we almost confuse prevention with predictability. We know at some point in time there will be a failure. So what I want to suggest to you is framing up the antidote to this overconfidence bias. And that is actually thinking about, well, what is at the heart of the unwanted event that we're concerned about? Well, really, it's about a serious injury or a fatality. And for shorthand, we'll call this a SIF. So if we're going to, as it were, shift the bow tie to a more balanced view, then the fundamental question we need to ask ourselves is, how will you fail safely? And fail safely is really around recoverability. So we've now got the loss of control event. How will we then recover from that? Now, in thinking about that, it's probably useful to think about what are some of the unique attributes of a SIF that give rise to this type of loss of control event. This is not an exhaustive list, but through the research, it indicates these are the sorts of things that then give rise to the rare event that would then mean that we need to focus on fail-safe to lead towards recoverability. And what we're fundamentally trying to do here is we're trying to reduce the severity of the injury to at least something which is minor or no injury. But in order to do that, we need to think about the nature of what gives rise to a SIF, because we know that we're dealing with a high consequence, low probability event, which sometimes we confuse with our ability to prevent, to think that we can then predict when this unwanted event will happen. So what we're talking about here is really a complex interaction of multiple things, parties, and decision-making, which is not always A leads to B, leads to C. We could describe this as being non-linear. It's also often novel. And what I mean by novel is it's unexpected. And when we have that unexpected event, it often can happen quite rapidly. And when that happens, it releases a damaging energy that often overwhelms the mitigating control that we've put in place. And if we think about it, not only do we have a lopsided bow tie, but often our mitigating controls really do not prevent the failure from moving from failure to safe. It just really tries to reduce something of the injury. So it might be, we'll have emergency response, we'll have first aid. In the event of inadvertent contact with electricity, we'll have a low voltage rescue kit, etc. But really, none of those mitigating controls fundamentally really change the position from fail to fail safely to recoverability. And often what happens is we have a gradual degradation of these sort of controls. They're not obvious over time. Often what we have is a person or a team who's trying to manage fundamentally a mismatch between the demand and the resources that they're trying to manage. And often in that, you get this almost imperceptible drift to failure. And so it's important as we start to think about this and how we're going to balance or achieve greater equilibrium in our bow tie and design better controls. This is the sort of thing that we're talking about when it comes to what gives rise to the serious injury. Here's a great example of fail safe. And this is the whole idea of fall arrest. And we assume that at some point, someone will approach the edge. Fall arrest is often set, so it removes you from the edge. That's fall protection. But fall arrest is designed that if you were to happen to tumble over the edge and to drop, then that fall arrest system prevents you from suffering serious harm. Now, obviously, there's an issue of being able to quickly recover the person from that position. If not, that gives rise to a number of other events and concerns. But nevertheless, here is a great example. And I'm going to finish today's presentation with other examples, and then we're going to move to a Q&A. So how are we going to, as it were, at least put greater emphasis onto the right-hand side of the bow tie? And I've got a number of guiding principles and questions that I think would be really useful to be able to explore when you go back into your own organisation or your own role and have a look at this. So how might we enable fail safe? And this is really the purpose of the rest of this morning's presentation. Well, I think the first thing is to go back to Derek Viner's model of damaging energy and to really recognise here that if we're trying to control the unwanted event, the loss of control event, really we need to be clear about what type of damaging energy are we referring to. This is by no means the sum total of all the types of damaging energy, but it's a fairly good list to have a look at. And if you think about what we can fundamentally do, we could reduce the amount of energy that could be released. We could create space between the release of energy and the person or team working in the vicinity of that. Often we'll talk about removing the person or the team from the line of fire. Or we could provide some sort of protection to the team or the team member working in that environment. So fundamentally, if we start thinking about fail-safe, what we're focusing on is how to deal with either containing, reducing, or diverting the release of the damaging energy. So here is a set of questions that might be really useful for you to use as you reflect on how a particular critical risk is understood. In other words, a risk that might give rise to a serious injury or fatality. And then what might you do to get this greater balance in the bow tie? And then secondly, how you might control better mitigating controls. So the first two questions are fairly obvious. So what type of damaging energy can be released? And this second question often gets overlooked in bow tie work, which is, will that release of energy cause a SIF? And so I think it's really important to apply a little bit of science to this and a little bit of both quantitative and qualitative research to determine how much energy needs to be released in order to result in the type of injury that would be serious or a fatality. And here are 5 questions then as you begin to then focus on fail-safe that you could use. So the first one is, and I've made this quite clear a moment ago, can that damaging energy be significantly reduced? So in working in and around this particular operation, in the design of that work, can we actually reduce the amount of damage energy that could potentially be released? The second is, could we somehow remove the person from the vicinity or the path of the damaging energy? Thirdly, we could think about how could we protect that person from the impact of the damaging energy? Fourthly, this is really important, what technology could be deployed to detect and automatically intervene and stop the damaging energy? So is there some sort of automated technology that could be used in safety and design that would remove the human from making a decision and operating something once we have the failure underway, the novel event? And then the last question, which I think rarely gets considered, could we actually use a combination of controls to build in a redundant capacity? So could we have more capacity than what we normally need in doing this task? So in the event of a failure, we recover because we have more capacity to then call upon. So if you think about why do these mitigating controls fail, and I like sometimes it's helpful to just put things into 3 buckets. So if we're going to design better controls, it's useful to look at the research. It's looking at what we've learnt from minor and significant failures. And there are 3 things that we learn. The first thing is we have an obvious absence of the intended control. The control was meant to be there, but for some reason it's not present, or we didn't think to design it. The second is we have a control, but it is in some way, once that damaging energy is released, it is in some way insufficient, or it is seen to be inadequate. And then the third one I think is really important. The damaging energy event was unimagined. So it goes back to the very reason why we have the lopsided bow tie because we have confused prevention with predicting something. So in our bid to be very thorough in prevention, we have lulled ourselves into a false sense of confidence that we can then predict when the unwanted event will happen. So if we're going to then focus on promoting better fail-safe and recoverability, then I think it's really useful to go back and look at the recent series of incidents in your own organisation or in your industry sector and apply this lens. Which controls were absent and hadn't been thought about, or were there but weren't operational? Secondly, which controls were insufficient? And then finally, how was the damaging event maybe not considered, or it wasn't, another way of putting it, was unimagined? And so you can see here a familiar piece of work from Todd Conklin and others about the blue and black line. Black line happens over time, and that's really about the way we intend work to be designed, how we've planned it, how we've resourced it. The blue line is the work done in reality. And you can see here, at times we exceed the expectations of the planned outcome. And other times we can drift into failure. And you can see there are a whole range of things which are often disconnected. They are non-linear, that give rise to the ultimate point of failure. And I think if we can understand what are those things that influence ultimately failure, and we take that into our design of mitigating controls, such things as changes in plans, weak signals, latent conditions lying in the system, cultural issues about a fear of reporting, an over-reliance on past successes, aspects of processes that are flawed or not well understood. Then we'll begin to start designing much more effective bow ties, which are balanced, but also mitigating controls that help us. So I think if we start to now move towards, well, how do we go about designing this? Here are 3 questions. And I think sometimes the other trap we fall into is that of the subject matter expert and who we define the subject matter expert to be. And if we're going to fail safe, there needs to be a conversation with those who do the work, those who undertake the work. And here are 3 questions that would be very useful to engage with people. The first one is, when you are doing this work, what part of the job can seriously injure, kill you or a team member? So this is not trying to create some sort of paranoia, but people will tell you, people are the frontline experts in doing this high risk work, which is not a daily occurrence. They will tell you what part of the job, and that's really the key part of this question. So what part of the job? The second question is very intentionally phrased. When this situation happens, not if, not maybe, not possibly, but when this situation happens, what keeps you from being seriously injured or killed? And this is really the beginning of starting to design much more effective controls, is finding out what people rely on. And you'll find all sorts of very interesting insights, adaptations, experience, solutions that you can now take into the more formal bow tie process. And then I think the last question is really helpful. Is this enough? And if not, what else needs to be put in place? And this really goes to the second aspect of what I've talked about, is sufficiency of control. So there are 3 questions that you might like to consider as you engage in this interesting exercise of designing a way that we could fail safe. I appreciate some of you might have been at the last MIOSH critical risk presentation, where Kelvin Genn talked about this idea of hierarchy of controls and human dependency. And we shared a model. I want to briefly touch back on this model. If you're unfamiliar with it, it'd be worthwhile watching the prior presentation from Kelvin. But you can see here that primarily what we've relied on over time is really the left-hand side. It's really been the hierarchy of controls. And we've tended to say anything above engineering we will deem to be a hard control. And anything that's administrative or PPE, we'll talk about that being a soft control or being somehow human dependent, reliant on people to do something. What we actually find is that in most cases, even as we move up the hierarchy of controls, unless we get to elimination, there is some degree of human dependency. And here is a way of thinking about a human-centered design for developing more effective mitigating controls. And I'm just going to take you through each of these 4 segments of the, if you like, the Mandarin. And we're just going to peel each one and briefly look at it and think about how might this then help us design these better controls in such a way that we fail safely because we have the capacity for recoverability. The first one is robustness. I think there's 2 really important things, and this is really where you get to engage subject matter experts. One is around hierarchy of controls, so being very clear about this mitigating control. Where does it sit within the hierarchy? And then what organisational factors are reliant on this hierarchy of control to work? So in terms of culture, in terms of system, in terms of resourcing, in terms of process, what does that robustness lie on? Because I think often we've seen the reliance of robustness just on the hierarchy of control and not given adequate consideration to the organisational factors. And another way of framing this is really James Reason's work about latent control. Often these are the latent effects and latent controls that sit behind these hierarchy of controls. So we have a look at this. We shouldn't confuse hard controls with robustness and effectiveness. The 2 do not necessarily equate because in all aspects, there is this degree of human dependency. And in a sense, often that model is unstable. And really what makes it stable and effective is fundamentally what people do in an organisation. It's how they use those hard controls. It's about the interdependency of the human factors that determines truly how effective the hierarchy of control is that's being applied on both the left and the right-hand side of the bow tie. So if we think about it, and we want to move to being more reliable and effective, we need to consider the fact that sitting beside these are a number of factors. And these are the sorts of things that would be very useful to take into your bow tie conversation when you're looking at a hierarchy of control and you're trying to determine how robust it is thinking things like culture, communication, change management, aspects of human-centered design. Does this fit the work that people are doing? How does this control play out in terms of maintenance and inspections? What happens when we have peak workloads? How reliant is this control on fitness for work and the reliability of people in making decisions? How does it interface with permits and procedures and ultimately training and competency? All these aspects will impact the human performance around these mitigating controls. I want to give you 2 examples. It's interesting if we look at lockout, tagout, a really important thing for dealing with stored energy, whether it be, sort of gas, air, electricity. How do we maintain that? Well, if you have a look, it's really interesting. Often we'll say it's an engineering control. It's designed to stop inadvertent contact or entanglement. But what's fascinating, if you have a look at that, most of the human performance factors are required to be in play in order for that control to be effective. If I take another example, and we'll have a look at a conveyor belt and the use of fire retardant and anti-static material in its design. You would say that this is substitution. So we have effectively moved up the hierarchy of control. But what is interesting, as we move up that hierarchy, we would see there is a less reliance on the human performance factors. And clearly here, what we're relying on is maintenance and inspection. So you'd probably say, if you were scoring this, this control is more reliable. It has a less dependence on people, and therefore it's a more effective control on the right-hand side as well in terms of fail-safe and recoverability. It's also important to understand human dependency, and that's what I've just been talking about, is really about the human factors and the user experience. And often in a bow tie, we don't give adequate time to that conversation about the end user. When is this control easy to use? When is it hard to use? The other thing that's really important is alignment. How does this control help or hinder the person doing the job and the actual overall task or demand or job or work that the person is trying to complete? So it's really helpful to think through that lens of alignment. And here's a really interesting picture. This is actually a colleague of mine from the US, Professor Mike Bem, who's a leading thinker in safety and design. And what's really interesting here, we have a look at the use of fall arrest, but you can see here that clearly the person has basically not been able to reach this maintenance task. And you can see what's happened here. They've obviously been then made the decision to uncouple from the fall arrest in order to reach into this very difficult spot. Many times we sort of observe this happening. Even when we put mitigating controls like fall arrest, can this then be reached 100% of what the worker needs to do? And then finally, there's adaptability. And this is really important. How well does this control that you've been designing on both the left and right-hand side of your bow tie respond to change? Because changes happen. And what we're seeing here is a rare change. It's novel. The change doesn't always give rise to failure, but it probably increases the capacity or the opportunity for failure. And then finally, how does this control, which is really the subject of this morning's conversation, how does this control then prevent or reduce the damaging energy? And so you can see here that if you were to take all these aspects into account, you'd begin to actually calibrate a much more effective way of working out, is this control adequate? Is it sufficient? And is it effective? And is it most likely to be used by those who actually are undertaking the work which is in and around this high-risk activity? Here are some examples of better fail-safe controls. This is just a snapshot where what we're planning here is we are planning for failure. We are planning for a loss of control event. And each of these begins to address removing the likelihood then of a serious injury or fatality. You can see here at the top left a really interesting thing. Obviously, climbing up ladders is a perennial issue. We address this with 3 points of contact, but you can see here that what's been installed on this ladder access is a rigid track trolley. So this ladder is affixed to the wall, you can see, and this person is actually attached to the ladder way. So if they were to lose grip, if they were to be knocked off this ladder, they wouldn't fall because this is a one-way slide and would lock them on the ladder. In the bottom left here, really interesting, you can see this suspended fall arrest that allows this person to freely move around this particular work site. You can see over here the prevention of dropped objects, but there's another layer on the other side of this. So even if it was to penetrate this netting, you can see then it would not only capture the tool that's dropped, but potentially the worker. And here are some examples of fail-safe valves. So rather than the valve exploding, there are mechanisms to release pressure on this particular valve. This valve has an automatic shutoff that doesn't require the person to come anywhere near that loss of control event. And here's interesting, there's an exclusion zone. So you don't have to worry about dropped objects at one level if you've got no one in the exclusion zone. And you can see here, this is alarmed. So it's alarmed both to advise you of the fact that this is an exclusion zone, but if you were to enter into this exclusion zone, it would then set off a trigger. So if you were somewhat distracted, you didn't see the sign, you inadvertently walked through into the exclusion zone, now it would sound a siren to those working in the area that this no longer is a sterile zone, that there's now someone in the exclusion zone. And these are just some. There are countless examples, which I'm really looking forward in a moment, Sarah, to people sharing some of their observations when it comes to designing better fail-safe controls. So what I've hoped to try and demonstrate this morning is a couple of things. I think firstly, the reason why we have a lopsided bow tie is we put an overly energetic focus on prevention. And I want to suggest to you that we should not in any way ease up on that, but we should put equal focus on the mitigating controls on the other side of the bow tie. Part of the reason why we end up with the lopsided is because we confuse prevention with predictability, and the two are quite different. We can certainly work to lessen the likelihood of this unwanted event where the damaging energy is released, but we cannot predict when the unwanted event or failure occurs. So the focus then becomes in design of fail-safe and recoverability. I've also suggested that we actually pay more attention to the damaging energy. How will the energy be released, which has really been partly answered by the left-hand side of the bow tie. But importantly, will that release give rise then to serious injury and fatality? If it will, then I've suggested to you a number of questions that you could consider in design. Then I've taken you to thinking about what are the reasons that these controls fail? And so it's either it's inadequate or it's absent, it's insufficient, or we haven't imagined the event. Then I've tried to show you 4 sort of considerations for designing a more effective or a more robust human-centered design. And then with that, I want to finish by just saying we really need to have a balanced capacity across 3 domains of work. So we need to give a capacity increase to prevention. And I think we've made certain progress. I look at the last 5 years in industry and high risk, we have got a lot better at preventing these sorts of incidents happening. We also need to give balanced capacity to the execution of the work that's being done. So the actual job, have we given people sufficient resources to execute the work safely? And then finally, to give balanced capacity, which is the purpose of today's presentation, to recovery safeguards. So with that, we have 15 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to hand you over to Sarah now to curate our question and answer. I really look forward to your thoughts. There might be a number of innovations that you've seen. Please feel free to share those. I'm really keen to hear about those. You might have further questions about what I've shared in terms of the process of thinking. Please ask those. But now, with 15 minutes to go, let me hand you back to Sarah.
Thank you, Mark. That was very informative, and the jam boards were very interesting. So I didn't mention earlier before the webinar started, but please put your Q&A questions, most of you know, in the Q&A panel on the Zoom webinar software. We'll just wait a few moments for that to happen. And getting some feedback on the chat from Brita, who said it was very good. Thank you. And still waiting for some questions.
don't want to let Sarah, they don't want to let me off lightly.
No, I know.
But with the presentation, I've designed it as a tool that you can take back. And I'm really keen for you to socialise these ideas. If these ideas are of value, we're really keen for you to socialise them. And
Okay, so Anonymous has asked, how do we sell that it's okay to fail when talking to the board?
that's a great question. I think what we do is we say that we give every effort to prevent, but because of the nature of the incidents that we're talking about, they are rare. They are, in essence, unpredictable in the total sense of predictability. And so what we're doing is, in those very small cases, we're ensuring that we live and breathe the values of the organisation. And most organisations will talk about their people. They will talk about the centrality of safe work performance. The other thing I think that's really helpful, I think, Sarah, with boards is really getting them to really think from a due diligence perspective about how well they are tracking insights through their due diligence data regarding these high risk events, which are, by definition, they are difficult to detect because they are of a low frequency. So I'd be challenging the board, Anonymous, to really get a discussion going. How do we pick up on these weak signals? How do we know, understand, monitor, verify, and comply and resource these type of events? But I think I'd rest the board assured and say, look, we're not out there actively encouraging these type of failures, but when and if they happen, we want to make sure that we fail safely. Is probably how I'd answer that, Sarah.
Okay, and Anonymous also asks, how can we make the workforce feel empowered to talk about and report failure?
This is really all about, I think, the way leaders engage and what leaders do with conversations, Sarah. A lot of people are reluctant to speak up because there's an absence of psychological safety. Or another way of describing it, there's a low level of trust. So if you want people to contribute, really these weak signals, these insights, we need to create an environment of high trust. So I think leaders can do this in two ways, Sarah. I think firstly, it's by the quality of our engagement with those who are doing work at the front line. If we approach the front line as the experts, is the first thing I'd say. The second thing, I think, is if we approach the front line with great curiosity about what is currently helping and hindering your work at the moment, and what do you need more or less of to be successful. The other thing I'd say about reporting, it's not just about trust, it's also about what we'd call safety efficacy. So it's about what you do with what's reported. Often people stop reporting, not because there's an absence of trust, there's a failure to act. And I think sometimes people raise things that we as leaders struggle to know how to respond to or have the resources. I think we need to be honest with people and say to people, that is a difficult challenge. I really want to engage you in part of the solution. I welcome your ideas. Let me share with you what we're doing over time. And I'd like to get your feedback. I think when we have those sort of adult to adult conversations, people are not only more likely to report, but they're more likely to trust. So there's some things I would say it's fundamentally, it's what leaders do, both in how they engage and what they do with what's reported. And most importantly, is to welcome, if I borrow from Patrick Hudson, is to welcome unwelcomed news. And sometimes we have to fight every fiber in our body not to react in a way that's knee-jerk, and to suspend judgment and to ask more curious questions. So back to you, Sarah.
Okay, the next question is a bit similar, I think, but I'll leave that for you. Is Thomas has asked, very impressive, how to sell it to the workforce.
Yeah, look, I think selling it to the workforce, I think, is saying to the workforce, look, we're realistic. There are times in the cycle of work that we're doing high risk activities. We know that we've put everything in place with the best of our judgment, our expertise, and our confidence. We put a lot of effort into verifying the effectiveness of controls, but we also recognize we can have failure. And so what I want to do is, where do you see that failure happening? When will it happen? How will we manage it? And I think if we start to have those sort of conversations, we won't frighten our workforce. We'll actually empower our workforce to bring their solutions. Because let's face it, they're the ones in the line of fire. And they're probably the ones who are thinking already about how to manage those unwanted events. And we need to find that out so we can then incorporate that into our management system. Back to you, Sarah.
Okay, so Michael asks, how do we explain fail to people in charge that go by hard and fast rules that people didn't follow the procedure and were injured?
Yeah, this is a great question, Michael, and it really goes to the heart of human error. And I don't know whether people had the privilege of attending the Wigglesworth Memorial Lecture this year, but Paul Salmon gave a fantastic presentation. A leading thinker and expert in human factors, professor in human factors. And he really went to the heart of challenging the usefulness of seeing work through the lens of human error. There's a recent document that's been released for the aviation industry, and it's actually for regulators, and a very helpful document. And I'll just make reference to it, Sarah, and people might like to have a look at it, and it actually really will help leaders who are wrestling with, well, it's bleedingly obvious, someone did something wrong. All we've got to do is find out who did what wrong, and then find out why they did the what wrong thing, and then punish them. The actual document that's come out is the ICAO document 10151. It's the Manual on Human Performance for Regulators. The Manual on Human Performance for Regulators has just come out, and I think it gives a very compelling argument for people who want to go hard and fast on human error and completely overlook the aspect of local rationality, which is, how did this make sense to the person who was trying to do this task at the time? What was their objective? What were they trying to do? And how did it make sense? Because normally those who go hard and fast are really entrapped in the world of hindsight bias. And of course, after the event, anything looks bleedingly obvious. And the document that I've just referred to outlines 5 very helpful principles. And principle 1 is that people's performance is shaped by their capabilities and limitations. So you need to understand performance through a much broader lens. The second principle that is argued is that people interpret situations differently and perform work in a way that makes sense to them. And sadly, most of our incident investigations do not get to the heart of understanding local rationality. Third principle is people adapt to meet the demands of a complex and dynamic work environment. And I've certainly covered that in this morning's presentation. Principle 4 actually borrows from Eric Holnagel's work on the idea that people assess risks and make trade-offs. And for those who are familiar with Eric's work, Eric often talks about there's always a trade-off between efficiency and thoroughness. And principle number 5 that's argued in this document, Michael, that might help, is that people's performance is influenced by working with other people, in other words, team and culture, technology, and the environment. So it's well worth having a look at. And I think it will be something that leaders who maybe are fairly locked into just seeing human error as the only way of understanding failure, it might broaden their horizon. So back to you, Sarah.
Okay, just in the chat, Julie asked, who was the safety and design brain you mentioned earlier?
Oh, yes. So that is Professor Michael Behm, B-E-H-M. Michael Behm from memory, our South Carolina University in the States. And
All right.
he's well worth looking up, his publications. He's published a lot in the space of safety in design. And he's a great colleague of Art of Work. And I know he'd be more than happy to take any questions from you. And he's at the East Carolina University. He's a professor of safety and design there at East Carolina University in the States.
Okay, well, we'll try and include some of these links in the email later today as well. Stacey asked, is there more information resources to further learn about predictive versus preventative in regards to bow tie assessment? Should love to explore that more.
Look, there is some interesting things. I think, there is useful to look at prior data that's given rise, and most of these sort of critical risks have a good body of research data that helps look at this issue of prevention versus predictability. Well, often in the mining industry, we'll use taxonomies, which are quite helpful, at least in informing that discussion around prevention and predictability. Another place to potentially start is our very good friend, Todd Conklin. And Todd wrote an excellent book on workplace fatalities. So if you haven't read Todd's book on workplace fatalities, that's a really good place. You can get that. Again, there are no sponsorships here, Sarah, but you can get that book. It's called Workplace Fatalities, Failure to Predict. And Todd has, along with Sidney Decker's book on Drift to Failure, have been two very influential thinkers that have shaped my thoughts about this point of prevention versus predictability. So certainly Todd's book on workplace fatalities is a great book to read. It's also a great book to share with others who might be struggling with this idea of human error. And Sydney's book, Drift into Failure, From Hunting Broken Components to Understanding Complex Systems, I think is also an excellent piece of work, along with his field guide into human error. Some other really useful insights that might help further this conversation about prevention versus predictability.
Okay, we've only got a couple more minutes to go and a couple of questions. So if there are any more, we'll give you Art of Work contact details in the email later. Stacey said, how can we influence shifting perspective to focus on the effectiveness of our human factor controls? And if we have to use the metric language to sell, in your opinion, what are some measurables to start the conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it really goes to the heart of trying to shift away from using injury metrics, because we know those injury metrics as important from meeting an ethical commitment in an organisation. They don't tell us a great deal about these low frequency, high consequence events. So I would suggest to you there's a couple of things that are worth looking at. Stay tuned. There's a very interesting paper that's just come out by Michael Toomer and Sidney Decker on adaptive capacity, and begins to start the thinking around how might you measure this adaptive capacity, which is another way of describing balanced capacity, is a really helpful thing. There's also some work happening on a due diligence index that's about to be released in the middle of this month. That'll be a worldwide release. It's a collaborative effort between Griffith University, Clyde and Co. Many people will know Michael Toomer, and Art of Work. And Sarah, we're giving that back to industry across the globe for free. It's a new set of metrics that will be used to help measure due diligence, which will really then help, I think, have a much better understanding about human factors. So there's some ideas, Stacey, and the other is we also obviously have a tool that I've shown that you can use to score against that 4-quadrant model that I showed around critical control, assessment and effectiveness. I'll hand back to you, Sarah, because I appreciate we've just gone on time. I'm not sure whether, Sarah, you might...
Sorry, yeah, talking to myself again. Sorry, but yeah, we'll leave it there for questions. There are a few more, but we'll send them through to you. I must say the feedback is amazing. So people are very appreciative of this information today. Mark, it's actually been amazing. I'll try and get as many of those links in the email as well that I've been scribbling down. All right. Thanks so much, Mark, for joining us. I hope we can do something again later in the year. Fantastic.
Look, well, thank you, Sarah and Miles, for the invitation to engage in this conversation. I'm really excited by how many people have joined, Sarah, and the level of engagement. And look, please feel free to reach out. We are very much wanting to build greater capacity in this area. And I wish you every success in whatever role you might have in your organisation to reduce, serious injuries and fatalities. So thank you for joining this morning's session.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks a lot, Mark. Talk soon. Okay.
Bye for now.
Bye, everyone. See ya.